Right. Well, greetings, everybody. I know normally when we have these stamp chats, we're exploring a particular alleyway or byway of Guatemalan philately, and I'm going to be breaking that trend just for today. And hopefully, normal service will be resumed, as Michael mentioned a second ago. But I am going to just have a little chat on my own views of the stamp collecting market as it is today, particularly with respect to Latin American collecting, where Guatemala fits into that, organized philately. And but before I get on to that, I mentioned that previously to Michael that what I would do is just like a little short introduction on something that we all have, which is what I call my stamp journey. And we've all got one of these stamp journeys as to where we started, usually as a youngster, and how we ended up collecting or working in stamps and where we are today. So my journey starts here with this stamp. And I started collecting, I don't know when, it's somewhere between 5 and 10, age 5 and 10. It does almost seem a bit competitive sometimes these days. I was reading a review of someone who was talking about how they first started getting involved in collecting stamps, and they said that they started at age 2. And I thought, well, you can't really get too much earlier than 2, but I'm not too sure I'd be keen to have a look at the album of a 2-year-old and quite what that looked like. But anyway, I was somewhere between 5 and 10 years. And when I was 9, my parents bought me a book, a beginner's book on stamp collecting. And this particular book profiled this little stamp, which was it had a disproportionate influence, which I'll touch on a little bit later on. But it is a stamp from Bechuana land showing some cattle under the shade of a baobab tree, one of Africa's great trees. And its first influence on my collecting, I suppose, was that I discovered a love of engraved stamps. I don't think I probably knew they were engraved at the time, but if they had one color or two colors, that was enough for me. So I started off with a broad worldwide collection, as we all do, but it wasn't very long before I filtered down into engraved only. And that really meant, certainly being based in the UK and having a fairly colonial bias, particularly when it comes to dealers over here, focusing in on George VI colonies. And of course, as a young chap, I couldn't afford 5 shillings and 10 shillings and £1. It was all halfpennies and pennies and two pennies, but I managed to put together a reasonable collection of line engraved stamps. And then I guess I entered the period that we all enter into after childhood as far as philately is concerned, which are the wilderness years when the collection put away or forgotten or stuck in the back of the cupboard and other things come to mind. I hadn't forgotten the baobab trees though that were on this first stamp that was my influence, and there I am in my 20s, next to a baobab tree similar to the one that you saw in the stamp. And I undertook this exercise to travel overland from London to the base of South Africa overland, through the across the Sahara out to West Africa, through the Congo to East Africa, and then down to South Africa, which took the best part of 9 months. But anyway, there's me next to a baobab tree on that particular journey. So the next landmark, not a landmark, that's a little bit over the top. The next point in my journey that I was going to mention, which is perhaps relevant to this particular audience, was my first purchase of a Guatemala stamp. Now, that was in 1993. And it wasn't a particular auspicious stamp. There it is. It is the 1992 America issue, 60 cents. Not a Guatemala stamp that most people would necessarily think about or prioritize as an important part of their collection. But it's particularly memorable because I bought it in Quetzaltenango post office. And I was traveling in Guatemala and decided that I'd buy a few stamps just as a little memento of my travels. And you can see that I've stuck them down there in my journal. And I don't know if you can make it out, but on the right-hand side there is the writing in my journal. And I reread it just the other day as I dug this out. And I mentioned that I've just visited Quetzaltenango post office, followed by the museum. And rather than the Aztec or the Mayan exhibits being the most impressive thing in the museum, it was the two-headed cow and the eight-legged sheep that caught my eye. And that was what I wrote down in my journal. You can see some of it there on the right-hand side. So yes, that was really my first introduction to Guatemala, was properly traveling around the country and visiting the sites. Like, there's me again. I expect some of you will no doubt recognize that as being Tikal. And for those of you who've been, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you who haven't, then it really ought to be on your bucket list, because sitting on top of these fantastic monuments with the howler monkeys shouting at you in the trees below is a very memorable trip. So now I'm going to fast forward once again in my journey to 2008. And I was at home and I was listening to the radio, and there was a review of a book. And the guy who was interviewing the author of this book, and he put out a publication called The Error World. And there it is. The Error World, an affair with stamps. And I'd forgotten about stamps for a long time at this point. They were stuck in the back of the cupboard. But I was listening to this guy talk, and I have here the book in front of me, and I'll let the book do the talking, because I'm just going to read you the introduction on the cover. And it says, "A funny and startlingly honest memoir about the things we treasure and the mistakes we make by way of midlife male obsession, tiny expensive bits of paper and love. When he was very young, Simon Garfield lusted after rare stamps but could not afford them. When he was older, the passion reignited with almost ruinous results." So this sort of started to whet my appetite. Then if you read the little bit of blurb on the back, it says, "Little do wives know how much men spend on their hobbies, but my wife is about to find out. I'm standing just inside the door of my marriage guidance counselor's house with a stamp album under my arm. I am in all kinds of trouble, emotional, financial, philatelic. I'm having an affair, my marriage is over, and I've built up a stamp collection I can barely afford." Well, that was the introduction to the book that I heard on the radio, and the guy talking about his experiences. All a true story, by the way. It's not a novel. It's his own experiences of building up a collection of very rare stamps with errors on them and how it cost him his marriage and all the rest of it. But fairly influential for me because it piqued my interest enough to buy that book, read it, and then think to myself, oh, I wonder what happened to my stamps, which I then dug out of the cupboard, and it's all been downhill ever since that moment. No, uphill. It's been wonderful. So I read the book, and before long, I'd not only had I bought that book, but I bought a Stanley Gibbons catalogue, and I started to reignite my interest in these recess printed stamps. But this time I could afford the 5 shillings and the 10 shillings and the pounds. And not only that, is that I decided I was going to go the mint not hinged route and only collect unmounted George VI. Oh, and on top of that, they all had to be perfectly centered as well. I was being very prescriptive and specific. And there was a dealer in the UK, Murray Payne, and Murray Payne produced the definitive George VI colonial catalogue. They were specialists in George VI. Unfortunately, they are no more. They got hoovered up by Stanley Gibbons and absorbed into their organization. But at every stamp show, I would go along to the Murray Payne stand and I would go through each country, issue by issue, stamp by stamp, choosing the one that I wanted or the ones that I wanted for my collection. And I did build up a very nice, very well-centered collection of George VI pictorials. But you do reach a point, as I'm sure other people will empathize with me, with you doing collecting, where you sort of reach a point whereby you're just sort of filling in gaps of one or two here, and you haven't got an awful lot to go for. So I thought, well, I want to expand my horizons slightly. Maybe what I'll do is I'll stick with exactly what I was doing previously, looking at engraved colonial stamps, which are pictorials, but I'll move further back in time and I'll concentrate on George V and Edward VII. So I started embarking on that as my next collecting interest. But because there was no one particular dealer that was specializing in this area, it meant having to mix and match from a whole variety of different dealers. And there is one particular whose name I shouldn't mention, who said, oh, yes, I can most certainly get you the stamps and the sets that you're after in the condition that you're after. But for what you're looking for, the type of condition that you're stipulating, very, very difficult to get hold of. I can get them for you, but it'll be double Gibbons if that's what you want. Which seemed rather an expensive purchase, but I thought, well, I'll give it a go with, naively, I'll give it a go with just 1 or 2 sets. Only to find out that, it was all very average and I could quite easily have done it myself by just being a far more patient and picking the ones that I wanted from different dealers' stocks as years went by. But needless to say, I never dealt with that particular gentleman again. But anyway, I carried on and I built up some wonderful sets in my eyes. Nothing to do with Guatemala, but that's Transjordan. A lot of people wouldn't necessarily recognize that as being part of the British Commonwealth / Empire stamp firmament, but one of the prettiest sets of stamps that I know. So I got my George VI, I got my George V, I've got a bit of King Edward VII. Well, where do I go next? Well, I couldn't actually go further back in time to Queen Victoria for 2 reasons. Number one, there were very, very few pictorials in the Queen Victoria era. And number two, the cost of early material, certainly in the condition that I was looking for it in, was just, astronomical and not feasible. So I had what I thought was a very good idea at the time to spread my wings as wide as possible and to move away from British colonials, and that I would just look at engraved stamps, but on a worldwide basis from about 1890 through to 1940, and I would cover every country in the world. Realizing quite what a task I had set myself.
Yes.
And at the time, I was working in the aviation industry, and I was out in the Middle East on a business trip. And I was having to catch the red-eye flight back from Dubai to the UK. And there was a point in time when Scott made its entire catalogue available as a CD-ROM. I think they learned very quickly not to do it again because everybody was downloading the CD-ROM. But I had a copy of the CDs, and I'd loaded them previously onto my laptop. And I boarded this plane in Dubai at about 10 o'clock in the evening or something. And I spent the entire flight going through the night, wading through the full Scots catalogue, making a note of the various different engraved sets from different countries that I was going to try and collect. And I ended up getting off at Heathrow with this massive list of stamp sets that I was going to be my goal to try to collect in the same condition of the ones that I'd previously collected. And anyway, to cut a long story short, it wasn't too long before I realized I'd embarked on an impossible task, and I really had to start to focus on one particular area. But one thing I noticed was that all the printers whose output I enjoyed, the Waterlows, Bradbury Wilkinson, Delaroux, American Banknote, there was a strong propensity for this material to crop up in Latin America. And so I decided to make Latin America my focus. And it was not easy to be able to just pick and choose these single stamps that I was wanting to try to get hold of to be able to build the collections in the same way that I'd had with the British colonials, because there were goodness knows how many dealers in the UK that specialized in that sort of material, but very, very few that specialized in Latin America. And those that were, people like Brian Morehouse, who some of you may very well remember, weren't really selling in the area that I'd decided to collect in, though. Brian's material was a lot more expensive and more specialist, a lot earlier, etc. So I was struggling. So I decided what I would do is that I would buy a few Latin American collections at auction, and then I would just take out the handful of stamps that I wanted. I know many people do this. Sell the rest on, and then, wash and repeat, as they say. And that's probably where that is where the main change occurred for me, because I suddenly realized that I was, not that I wasn't interested in the engraved stamps, but it was the earlier stamps that were really starting to capture my attention. And it was the write-up of the albums, and it was the postal history and the rates and the cancellations and the forgeries and all the rest that goes with it that I found enthralling. And I pretty much stopped collecting in the traditional sense, because what I came to realize that my true calling, or what I loved doing, was actually the learning of the stamps themselves and building up a decent, oh, there we go. There's one I collected years ago. That's from Bulgaria, if you haven't come across him before. Nice Bradbury Wilkinson, I think that is. But yeah, collecting a whole raft of information on various different stamps and countries, and researching and just gathering information, buying a collection, learning all about it, selling it on and using the proceeds to then go buy another collection and learn all about that. And really, that's what I've been doing over the years, for quite a few years now, and just simply building up my own knowledge and getting interested and involved in all sorts of different aspects of Latin American philately. And then 2016, I launched my website, just talking about various different aspects of philately, and here I am today. So there we go. That is my stamp story before I get on to the second part of my conversation about my views on the Latin American market. Right, let me take a quick glass of water before I go on to part two. So these are a mix of my own views, a mix of views that I've taken from other people, but some of them you may very well have heard before. But it's just a snapshot. It's a snapshot of my views of the stamp collecting environment, the marketplace at the moment, where I think it's going, and the trends that I personally see. And you don't have to search too hard in the philatelic press these days to read letters or a commentary piece bemoaning the decline in interest in philately. And I disagree entirely, to the point where I would say I would posit exactly the opposite and say that I think philately's probably entered a golden age, where it offers a depth of access and experience that previous generations just would not believe. And if you look at the proliferation of online dealers and casual sellers and part-timers, the whole availability of material today compared to what it was just a few decades ago is completely changed in a very short space of time. And with that availability comes the opportunity to be particularly picky, to be able to choose, choice examples where once upon a time you would have had to have put up with whatever the local dealer could produce for you, because you've got access to so much more stock to choose from. So over the past few years, of course, you've got the omnipresent eBay and Delcamp and Hipstamp that we all know so very well, but also you've seen all the auction houses, almost to a fault. Almost every one of them has now had to go online in some shape or form, meaning that we are constantly presented with a stream of choice morsels to which to choose from. And the change has been dramatic, but you don't really necessarily think about it or notice, because it's been so incremental as the years have gone by. And the same thing has happened with philatelic information as well, whereas once upon a time you might have had to go to your local library or even a philatelic library if you had one locally. There is now just so much that you can obtain online. We almost expect that it's just going to be there waiting for us, or there are forums that we can join to be able to ask questions, etc., etc. So this is why I would call it a golden era, because I think we're truly spoilt for choice. And I don't buy into this theory of the shrinking collector base either. I think it has changed, most definitely. People are collecting in different ways. And I think the emphasis on a global basis has changed country to country. Certainly there's a far greater presence of Asian collectors than there's ever been in the past. But the total number of collectors out there, I don't necessarily see as shrinking. And just as an example of Asian collectors in general, last year that we had the Taipei 2023 show, and that delivered, I think, around 225,000 attendees, most of them who were younger rather than older. And then I know everyone always would roll out Chinese statistics when you're trying to look at large groups of people, but the last China show was over 1 million attendees. I mean, these are vast numbers, very different to the numbers that you might see in Europe or in the States these days, but still showing an incredible increase or incredible maintenance of the number of people who are interested in philately in some shape or form. And then, well, what about the actual sales of stamps? And eBay itself has allowed a reasonable amount of transparency with regards to numbers. If we just look at Latin America over the past 3 months or on a quarterly basis, eBay has around 50,000 plus transactions of Latin American only stamps over a 3-month period. So that's in excess of 200,000 transactions per year just for the Latin American market. If you see how that breaks down on a regional basis, those are the figures for the 20 republics. Obviously, no Cuba because eBay doesn't want to show, or doesn't allow Cuban sales. A few things that you might notice. The first is that I think Guatemala is holding its own. It's in 10th position, but that position is above what I would consider some larger collecting markets such as Venezuela, Ecuador, Uruguay. Mexico in first place, I don't think is a great surprise. Mexico is by far and away the most popular and the busiest of the Latin American markets, and Brazil and Argentina, again, I think in a fairly logical position. That's the order I would have put them in without even seeing the eBay figures. A couple of anomalies, perhaps Paraguay, higher in number of transactions than one might have guessed, but I think that's probably due to the huge amount of thematic material that Paraguay issues. All sorts of wallpaper, which is, oh, I shouldn't use that term, should I? That's a little bit derogatory. All sorts of wonderful pictorial designs, which I know would appeal to people that collect thematic material. And the other one that's perhaps a little bit unusual is Nicaragua, which is quite high up there. So you might ask yourself, well, why is Nicaragua the 5th most collected country when it's a much smaller Central American country, probably with a smaller collector base? But we're looking at number of transactions here, and if you look at the total number of stamps that Nicaragua has issued with all its multitude of overprints and provisionals, etc., the opportunities that you would need to actually build a collection of Nicaraguan material effectively means that you'd need to make far more transactions to get there. So I think that that's why that is there. And that's just one sales channel. So someone is buying this stuff. But familiarity does breed complacency. And as I mentioned, change does often happen by stealth. And we tend to focus less on the transformational effect that digitization has produced over recent years, but we do focus on the loss and the disruption that it's causing, particularly in organized philately. And there's, as we know, a few consequences of that. I think if you had spent a lot of good money on certain philatelic items before this disruption, you might not be necessarily getting your money back because the price has softened in many areas. I think one of the reasons it's softened is because once upon a time there was a near monopoly of auctioneers and dealers, and you were fairly well, limited to those that you knew or those you had access to or could work with. Whereas now, everyone and his dog sells stamps in some shape or form, it would seem. And so the availability of material and the transparency of pricing has become much more obvious. And I think the market is still settling down and finding its place. I think another quirk of online pricing is at the opposite end of very expensive material is inexpensive material. So whereas Scott has been, pricing inexpensive stamps at 20 cents and 25 cents and 50 cents for many, many years, you can often struggle. In fact, you probably will struggle to purchase a stamp at 25 cents or 50 cents, because if it's being advertised on one of the marketplaces, it's going to actually cost more than that to pack and to send. And why should someone be bothered with a 25-cent stamp in the first place? So you end up with this rather unusual situation whereby you have to pay many multiples of catalogue price sometimes to buy a very inexpensive stamp. So whether the catalogue editors will catch up with that in time or not, I'm not so sure. In general, with regards to the overall markets in demand, I think Latin America is holding up extremely well. In fact, internationally, I would say it is, if not certainly one of the most popular areas. This was reinforced by a comment from Kelleher's about 12, 15 months ago. There is a cooling of the market for Great Britain and colonial issues, as well as the rest of the Europe, Latin, South and Central American markets remain strong, driven by the very low supply. And I would agree with that statement. Now, the other casualty that we're becoming rather familiar with, and maybe casualty is too strong a word, but one of the knock-on effects of this digitization that we've been experiencing over the years is the so-called decline in organized philately. And I think that is a decline. And I can't see ultimately that it will stop or halt, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a decline in stamp collecting. I think the two are completely separate. And this isn't a purely a philatelic phenomenon either. If you look at the service clubs of the past, so people like the Lions or Rotary or the Masons, these are all societies which have been in long-term decline over 20 or 30 years or so, as far as membership is concerned. And it's across every group. It's just that society is now operating in a slightly different way when it comes to the things that you do in your spare time. So it isn't that I don't believe that stamp collecting is declining at all, but I do see that there is a definite difference in how collectors connect and share and discover. Now, Tom Draghi, who runs Stamp Auction Network, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and have bid on in the past, released some very interesting numbers last year. And he hired a social media marketing professional to map out how stamp collecting is now represented in the main social media channels. And I think it really emphasizes this shift. So Facebook now has 51 stamp collecting groups with 478,000 members. Twitter has 90 stamp collecting groups with 422,000 members. And Instagram has just under 30 with 49,000 members. Now, there is going to be some duplicity between those membership groups. That's a million there in total, but I would imagine that figure will be reduced once you look at multiple memberships. And many of those may be people who are just casually interested, of course. But if you just took a fraction, if you just took a small percentage of that 1 million and you put them into organized philately, then suddenly you would see the numbers increasing dramatically. Now, that isn't going to happen, but it does illustrate how collectors have moved either from one channel to another channel, or are naturally moving to the one channel and sticking with it and not actually going into organized philately in the first place. Another interesting piece of research that Tom came up with is that Stamp Auction Network also has its own TikTok site. I don't know how many of you have used TikTok, but that's not necessarily the place that you would expect to see philatelists and stamp collectors. But they developed their own channel. Stamp Auction Network has over 8,000 subscribers on that channel. And what's really interesting is the demographics, in that of those 8,000 subscribers, 60% are under 44 years old and 40% are under 34 years old, which is just not a demographic that you would typically see in traditional organized philately. And it's just another illustration of how the needle is moving in a different direction. These are just snapshots, but it just shows you how there are some fundamental changes underfoot. So this era of treasurers and membership secretaries and presidents and so on and so forth, I'm not saying it's one that belongs to another era, because I definitely would 100% prefer that that philatelic organizations continue as they are, but we do have to be very cognizant that things are moving in a different direction. So where does this leave the philatelic societies of Latin America? And this was a thought prompted by David Lindwall, who dropped me a line the other day and got me thinking as to, well, where does it leave things? If we look at things holistically, the Latin American philatelic societies broadly break down into two camps. We have the English speaking and we have the Spanish speaking. So there is a Latin American club, a society in the Netherlands. There's a Argentinian and Brazilian society in Germany. But for all intents and purposes, you've got your English speaking and your Spanish speaking. And the English speaking are all APS affiliates that are all US based. You have Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Guatemala, of course, Haiti, Mexico and Nicaragua. And many, like we are at the moment, have struggled at some stage to be able to find sufficient volunteers to run the organization as effectively as we would want, and often with committed members having to multitask in more than one role. And these difficulties are often compounded by the call for submissions for the journal, for the magazine, to be able to consistently maintain enough content. But as I say, I'm a big fan of philatelic societies, and I definitely would want to see them personally continue to thrive. But if they don't, then what are the other options? So one option is almost the default, effectively, which is to put a society on ice. In other words, it's maintained even though it doesn't necessarily have the volunteers there to be able to run it efficiently. And this is the route which has unfortunately befallen the Brazilian Philatelic Association, which has effectively been rudderless since COVID. They had one individual who was effectively multitasking across various different disciplines. He unfortunately passed on, and no one has come in to be able to fill the gaps. So the Brazil Philatelic Association is effectively still in existence, sitting there waiting for volunteers. It also, unfortunately, is one of the few philatelic associations that didn't do anything about digitizing its journal. So one of the most valuable assets, I think, of any society is its journal, or certainly its historic journal, and all the issues that you can read up on from the past. And unfortunately, they didn't do that. But hopefully, that will be remedied at some stage in the future. But that's a very reactive scenario where effectively you sit and you wait. There is a more proactive option, which is moving from a formal structure to a more fluid, flexible model, where you're effectively doing away with boards and legal statuses and membership dues and AGMs and regular journals, etc., all those commitments. But you're still allowing a regular dialogue to happen between members and people who are interested in communicating with one another. Now, that has a downside, and the big downside is stagnation, in that you could end up with nothing because still nobody comes forward to do anything. But if you do have enthusiastic individuals, it doesn't prevent anybody from stepping forward in a more ad hoc fashion to be able to drive the society forward in different ways. And providing the audience can communicate, then new initiatives are going to ebb and flow. And you see that with these Facebook groups that I was mentioning earlier on. Probably the biggest success in this space from a Latin American perspective recently, as most of you will know, is Mi Oficina, which really only started just before COVID. They now have over 2,000 subscribers. They've released 700 videos. Doesn't seem to show any sign of stopping, but there's no formal structure, as it were, to the society. There's no membership fees. It's effectively run by enthusiasts, and that seems to work. Another example, coming back to Brazil in complete contrast. So if you look at the Brazil Philatelic Association, you see that absolutely nothing's happening. You'd think, oh, there's a considerable decline then in Brazilian philately, when in fact that's not the case at all. One of the most recent achievements is by Filibras, which is the Association of Brazilian Philatelists. They too have only been in existence for the past few years or so, and they've managed to recruit just short of 1,500 members over that period. They've also released their own Brazilian catalogue, the Filibras catalogue. And again, you know, there's no membership fees, but there's no regular journal, there's no regular this, there's no regular that. You take out the regular commitments, it doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't got committed, enthusiastic individuals that want to drive things forward. My goodness me, how are we doing for time? Right, I'll try and wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. So there is one final alternative perhaps to think of, and this is a bigger alternative, which is around consolidation. So any small philatelic society is going to have its editor and is going to have its membership secretary and treasurer and presidents and so on and so forth. But it's much the same for a larger society as it is a small one. So by amalgamating, by putting smaller country societies under one banner, the benefits of scale could theoretically be realized in the same way that they are in a corporate environment. So your volunteer pool increases, you know, despite the roles being very similar to that of a smaller society. The larger membership group brings economies of scale, and of course you've got far more variety of content to offer as well. So perhaps in the future a Central American philatelic society could be a realistic proposition, or even a Latin American philatelic society in general could be a viable proposition if all grouped together in some shape or form. And this was the case years ago with the main sheet, which ran from 72 to 2000 and something, I think. And lastly, we shouldn't miss out on the realization that one could easily merge the Spanish speaking and the English speaking together with the benefits of AI and some very instant translations, which just need a little bit of editorial tweaking to be able to produce content for both groups. And someone that's been particularly good at that is the Cuban Philatelic Society, who's already multilingual, and that's a snapshot from their journal where you can see it's written in both Spanish and English and appears to anybody of either language. Right, I think that's probably time up for me. I haven't left an awful lot of space. I didn't realize I was able to rattle on so long. But in summary, times may be changing inflationally, but I believe the future is still bright. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Nick. That was a fabulous, absolutely fabulous. I'm so glad we did this today. That was great. I would like to make a few comments on based on your last comments in terms of where ISGC is with regard to the spectrum of types of philatelic organizations that you describe. We are pretty highly organized in the sense that we have a board, we have a journal, we have a lot going on. One of the considerations that I just went through myself, Nick, on a personal level, is I know I had said I would step down, but in looking at that spectrum, I realized, and I wrote this to all the board members. I'm sorry, everyone here doesn't have access to that letter. I said, because I feel committed to the organization, I couldn't step down and leave to Providence what happens next, because what happens next could be what you describe as putting the ISGC on ice. So I really appreciate your comments in that direction. I also found it really interesting, the concept of combining, consolidating into a Central American society or even a Latin American society. I don't know that we're moving in that direction or should move in that direction, but it's certainly a possibility. It's getting more and more difficult to find volunteers, as you said. Now that I'm involved in judging, I look at the shows, the philatelic shows we have, and they're struggling. They're struggling for the same reason the societies are struggling, and shows are being put on ice. Shows are literally losing their certifications because of leadership issues, and we're going to see a diminution of that. Shows that continue to exist are having problems getting exhibitors for much the same reasons. In any case, Nick, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. And I just want to remind everyone that for these presentations to continue, we need someone now to become the coordinator for our stamp chat. So please, if you have any interest at all, write to me, call me, send up smoke signals, because I think it's critical that this continues. So Nick, again, thank you. I'm just going to open it up for any comments or questions now.
I have a question for Nick. The problem with the volunteer situation, I was wondering if sometimes we tend to think that people are too busy, and that's why we don't have volunteers. Do you feel that perhaps the fact that it can be done easier, we could do it online kind of thing, we could use the AI and all that, makes people less willing to volunteer because that's available now?
I don't know. I think it's a number of things. I think that the difference is if you went back a few decades, I think you'd tend to find that people's overall hobbies and their focuses were a handful of few, whereas now everyone has so many interests in so many different areas. So the amount of time that people have available, I think, is probably less. But also because you've got all these new digital channels to spend time exploring, the commitments to a particular society are just, one area in amongst a whole other area. So I think you've got to have the time as well as the motivation, and I think that's what people tend to struggle with. I mean, personally, I'm working full time, so until I retire, I don't think I'm going to have the bandwidth to be able to do many of the things that I'd like to be able to do. And maybe that's the same situation with others.
I think there's also the issue of the digital divide. I know before my father passed, anything, email was a challenge for him. So anything online was, he would much rather go to a local stamp club or go to a stamp show, get a catalog in the mail. So I think sometimes it's, there is that divide where you have people that are not as comfortable getting into a digital environment.
Well, I would think with Zoom such as we have now, that would actually be advantage. That would actually, you know, that would make it even better.
Well, for those who know how to operate it.
That's a good point, Richard. So many of us have different talents or comfort levels. So you talk about Zoom, Alexia. You got Zoom, you got TikTok, you got Facebook, you've got Twitter, and not everybody uses all of them. So we've split our people's interests and access. For example, hate to tell you, I don't use Facebook. Alexia, I don't go onto our Guatemala Facebook. I've never been on TikTok, never. And Zoom, only Zoom for these chats with the Guatemala Society. So maybe there's too much availability, and we've picked one or two that we will be comfortable with. I don't know.
Nick, I wanted to also say I appreciated your comment about the philatelic wilderness that after people leave their youth, that they enter, I guess, in their 20s and maybe early 30s. That's I think that is very apropos for people that started as a youngster or a teenager, then took a little respite from it. It's important, I think, once people kind of settle down and they start to look at, okay, I've got a family now, or I'm established in my career, and I can sit down and take a breather and engage in a hobby, sort of picking those people back up.
Yeah.
Nick, years ago, Jack Jonesa told me that he thought one issue facing stamp collecting was the loss of millionaires, and that sort of coupled with the loss of market makers like Michael Morehouse. And so what we have is a lot of $1 covers on eBay with lots of bidders, like your statistics showed. But it's not maybe healthy for people to be collecting penny stamps, and it's not sociable. The millionaires used to compete with each other, and they would go to a show and show each other what they'd bought, and it was fun for them. I mean, it was competitive, but it was in a spirit of camaraderie, and I think that that's part of this. Going on Facebook is not a sociable activity. It's a self-centered, find information or whatever, that isn't a societal kind of activity. Do you think that societies maybe just have outlived their usefulness?
Yeah, I just think it's part of a much wider trend. If you look outside of the philatelic context, if you just look at children today, there are so many reports whereby you see that they don't necessarily interact with one another because they're constantly, like
Right.
this, staring at the phone the whole time. Even to the extent where things such as telephone calls don't get picked up and people don't leave messages anymore or voicemails, etc. All the communication is done by text. So people don't even want to talk one-to-one, let alone get together in groups in societies. So if you can't get two people to talk with one another, let alone in a big group, then it doesn't sort of hold out an awful lot of hope for the society model ultimately. But that doesn't mean to say people aren't interested in collecting, and it doesn't mean to say people aren't interested in communicating or learning. It's just that they want to go about it in a way that was different to, the generations which went before.
I think,
Well-
if I might break in on that thought, all those people picking up $1 covers, as you say, some of them are going to do something intelligent with them and create value out of that. The millionaires were all focused on very narrow areas that somebody defined 50 years ago. You create, at least most of my experience has been in Russian philately. You can create so much value just by researching something thoroughly that hasn't been researched. And all of a sudden, then the material is worth something. But you've got to make the key step of getting it published in a journal or exhibiting it. And that's, you know, one of the, I'm sort of catching up with that late. And now that I'm almost retired, I'm having to do a lot of catch up in that area.
David, if I can comment on that, that's one of the driving forces behind doing our new handbook, is the fact that we're adding value by publishing material that people haven't seen before, stamps and proofs and essays they haven't seen before, and all of a sudden our collections are worth a little bit more, and the market is pushed up just a little bit.
And if I could piggyback on that, Michael, I think also with the articles in EQ, yeah, and I'll just take it as an example, a $5 cover that I bought. It's actually one of the highlights of my German exhibit. It was from one of the deported Germans interned in the U.S. back to his daughter in Guatemala. And it's one of less than 10 that I know of that exists. But I think I got it for $3 or $5, something like that. The stamp's not particularly valuable, but when you find out who it's from and what the context was, you know, if I were to, you know, I could probably sell it at an auction house for a couple $100.
Right.
Not
I'd
that
like
I'm
to
going
add, we're running a little short on time. We're going over the limit. I just wanted to tell you something I noticed last night that I think you might want to check out. Everyone knows Jake Tapper from CNN. Jake Tapper is doing a series on politics and corruption. And one of the subjects he talks about is Mark Sanford, who was the governor of South Carolina. And his main assistant, Mark Sanford's main assistant, was Scott English, the executive director of the American Philatelic Society.
Just finishing up a stamp chat online.
And an international too. I don't know, Nick, but one series is on Mark Sanford, and there's Scott English, an extensive interview on what happened when Mark Sanford went missing. Was supposed to be on hiking the Appalachian Trail, but instead was with his mistress in Argentina. So you might want to look for that on television.
Can I just jump in with two quick things? Richard, did you get my email for the TPOs? And has anybody heard from Yuri at all lately? Because I've emailed him twice with the TPO information of the collection I got, and I've had no reply at all.
I'm
And
sorry,
I
who's
he
that?
hasn't been on the meetings.
Who are you asking about?
Yuri Montes,
Oh,
looking into, who's been doing all the TPO research and everything. I've heard nothing from him for a couple of months. Nobody's heard anything from him. Okay.
no.
Right.
No.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make one comment before we go. We can sit here and talk forever about why this problem exists, how much it exists, blah, blah, blah. But we as a club have to think about what we want. Do we want to continue? Do we want to support it? What do we want to do? Each one of us individually need to think about this, because we can just talk about all the problems, but we have to solve our problem. So I just want to leave that as a final thought.
And we have a real problem. We need someone to coordinate these talks. Well, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but I hope we solve this problem quickly. Any other comments? This is an important session we've just had, I think. And Nick, that was so far and above what I thought was going to happen today. I'm really appreciative.
Oh, I'm glad to hear you had very low expectations of me, Michael.
That's the secret to That's the secret to happiness and accomplishment. On that note, then, I will say goodbye to everyone. Hopefully, we'll have a program next month. We do have one scheduled, and let's hope we have someone to coordinate it.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.
Bye all.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Right.
Bye.